Good day. My name is Chetan Gordon. I'm a cloud solution architect in Microsoft in the data and AI space. Today, I'm going to talk to you about Synapse, Azure Synapse. Data is being created everywhere. Businesses are looking at using this data to gain insights and to be able to make strategic decisions based on patterns identified in the data. But this does not come easy. Let us look at some of the challenges in a data-driven world. The challenge here is clear. Companies have to step up to the challenge that data is arriving faster than we can consume it. We have therefore to find a way to automate the consumption of this data, to deal with the data overload, and bring data into the enterprise in a timely way for business to be relevant and to analyze and act on. We often hear the terms data warehouse, structured, unstructured data, ETL, ELT, MPP, SMP, and big data, to name a few. What are all of these concepts and what do they mean? I will attempt to explain a few of these so that it gives you an understanding of when and why to choose an architecture or technology. This is important to achieve the correct outcomes for business. Each application in a customer environment commits data to a database. If we look at the examples we have in the customer environment, these could be applications like line of business applications, web applications, ERP and CRM applications. These are transactional in nature and therefore are referred to as an OLTP system and data stores. When the nature of the data have lots of reads and writes, and there's a row-by-row processing, a data warehouse is not recommended. In this case, the option to use are database management systems like Azure SQL Database, Cosmos DB, and others. The database normally uses a symmetric multiprocessing architecture, SMP. SMP is a high-spec server that hosts the data based on the CPU, shared the memory, and disks of the server. In an SMP architecture, the database has a single instance of the OS. It shares the memory between the processes. It shares the disks that the data is committed to and uses a common bus. To increase the performance, the approach is to add more of the shared resources like memory or storage. This is a scale-up approach. In a data warehouse world, the architecture is different and it follows an MPP architecture. So what is an MPP architecture? In an MPP architecture, you have a control node and a compute node. A control node controls how data is distributed and manages across the number of compute nodes. This architecture therefore allows you to scroll horizontally, and the processing of this data is done in each compute node. This therefore benefits from compute power available at each compute node. There is a shared nothing architecture and will allow you to process data faster. Data is distributed and processed on each compute node, and the distribution of data is called sharding. There are different types of sharding that will help you speed up the data distribution and reading the data for analytics and reporting use. We will leave the various types of and benefits for another discussion. When data is processed and read, the control node then consolidates the information and renders this out to the clients consuming the data. Now that we understand the architectures for data warehouse, let's look at the components that make up an analytical solution. A modern data warehouse is a process that enables data to be consolidated, curated, and analyzed to be able to provide businesses with insights and analytics. Let us look at the makeup of a modern data warehouse. Disparate transactional systems, line of business applications, IoT real-time streaming systems, all have data that can be used to gain insights for business. Consolidating this data and overlapping data will allow stakeholders to gain a better understanding of their business. The first part of a modern data warehouse is to identify these sources and ingest them in its natural form onto a platform to analyze and be available to explore for insights. Part of this process also involves curating this data for business use, insights and strategic decision making. Additionally, data can be used to build AI models using machine learning to allow business to make predictions. Reporting plays a key role in a modern data world, providing the data and insights to business close to real time as possible to be relevant in a competitive data-driven world. Azure has services and platforms to help achieve this, and our latest innovation in the space is Azure Synapse. All of the steps required for a modern data warehouse can be performed on Azure Synapse platform. Now that we understand the basics of the data warehouse process, how does Azure Synapse fit into all of this? To better understand this, we need to first look at the components that make up Azure Synapse. Azure Synapse is a limitless analytics service that brings together enterprise data warehousing and big data analytics. It gives you the freedom to query data on your terms using either the serverless or provisioned resources at scale. Azure Synapse brings these two worlds together with a unified experience to ingest, prepare, manage, and serve data for immediate BI and machine learning needs. The first component that is contained in a Synapse environment is the data lake. The data lake will store any files and unstructured data. The next major component in the Synapse environment is the platform, which gives you the functionality to manage your data assets, apply security, monitor data use, and as a metastore for business data. You then have the two analytics runtimes available for you, the SQL and Spark engines. Synapse allows the user to execute scripts and business logics using the provisioned or the on-demand form factors to execute the scripts and business logic. Synapse supports multiple languages, example SQL, Scala, R, and .NET. To enable ease of use, Synapse provides functionality in the designer for a low-code or a code-first approach to build data flows and transformation pipelines. Integration to services for AI and machine learning is possible from the Synapse environment, including Power BI. This allows for seamless enterprise integration to be successful. Let's look at a mapping of components of a modern data warehouse to Synapse. Let us look at how you can use Azure Synapse for the various components that make up a modern data warehouse architecture. Under ingest, you have the Synapse pipeline. Under the prepare, you have Synapse SQL serverless and Synapse pipelines or the Synapse Spark engine. Under transform and enrich, you have Synapse SQL provisioned or the Synapse pipeline. And then you also have the Spark engines and the serverless engines as well to be able to do this. Under the serve, you've got the SQL Synapse provision services, and you have the SQL Synapse serverless services. And then to visualize, you have integration into Power BI to be able to see your reports from within the Synapse environment. For the demo, assume that the business will have received customer lists from various providers. The providers send the lists using CSV files by placing these files into storage container. One of the biggest challenges in this is that multiple providers send files in various formats. Let's look at a sample of these files. In our demo, we will receive the files into the storage container that resides in my data lake. These files come from various providers and they have different schema formats. What we'll do is we will build a data flow pipeline that will ingest these files into the data warehouse, into staging tables. Once the data from the files are in staging tables, we will then execute a step that will ingest that files from the staging tables into the production tables, and thereafter show you how to link up Power BI into your workspace and report off the data that resides into the production tables. This is all done within the Synapse environment. All right, so now for the demo. I've opened up my Azure tenant, and as you can see, I am in my resource group called Modern Data Architecture. Within my resource group, I've deployed all of the services required and including the services for Azure Synapse. Now, in our scenario, remember we spoke about these three files that would be residing in a container. What I want to do is just show you the three files that I have in here. So I have these three files, version 1.0, 1.1, and 1.3. And you'll see when we look at the definition of these files, they are CSV files, and the first row contains the header information and then the data. If you look at the first row for file number 1, it contains a certain number of fields. If we look at the same row for the next file, which is version 1.1, you'll see we've got an additional field called B customer valid and TT customer. And if you look at the third file in this 1.3, we'll see we've additionally got address 1 and row. Now, previously, if you've worked with three different schema of files, you would have had to either do a process of cleaning up the files to have a consistent schema, or have three different pipelines to ingest these schema files that are different. So in our case, we're going to build one pipeline to ingest all three files into the data warehouse. Additionally, I want to point out here is we have one additional file here that doesn't conform to the naming conventions of these three files. And in our pipeline, we will exclude this file as the processing continues. So this is my data warehouse, my SQL pool, and I've registered this in my Synapse environment. Now, if you look here, I just want to highlight a few options here that I thought it's relevant. Firstly, the pause and resume functionality. So on our data warehouse in Azure, you have the ability to pause your data warehouse when you're not in use. This becomes a really cost-saving habit, especially for your dev and test environments. The additional highlight here is how to scale up a data warehouse. If you have a look at what the scale option provides for you, is an scroll bar that you would just increase as you require more performance. In our case, if I want to increase this up, you could see I could easily then drag and drop that. But for now, I'll just leave it as the same. Okay, now that we've spoken about the data warehouse, let's go and have a look at the data in the table that we're going to go and populate. So for our example, we're going to populate the customer table in the data warehouse. And in our case, the customer table is currently empty. So if I look here, it has 0 rows. A quick highlight here, I've executed this query on my warehouse using the browser interface of Query Editor from within the data warehouse. So this is another cool feature to run quickly, statements in your data warehouse to maybe track progress or look at, what data sits in that warehouse. Little hint for you to just explore. Okay, so now that we know that the table is empty, let's look at the next screen. The next screen I've got open is my Synapse workspace. And in my Synapse workspace in Azure, you'll see on the left, the pane here has all of the options for you to go and configure your Synapse environment. Things like, access control. From a security perspective, you could restrict access to the Synapse environment or restrict what the users can do in the Synapse environment. Additional things you could do here is set up your Synapse pool or your Spark pools from within the space, and then setting up your firewall rules that allows security on the Synapse environment, including things like private endpoint connections. Now, to go into the Synapse environment or the Studio environment, you would click on this open link here, which will then open to the Synapse environment. Now, on the landing page of the Synapse environment, we're on the home. These are all called hubs. Now, your hubs are basically areas where you would want to go and do some work in. A highlight at this screen is the useful links that I'm hovering over now. This gives you documentation and overview, documents or videos around what Synapse is. I highly recommend you spend some time and evaluate these links in the Synapse environment. Okay, under Home, the next tab is Data, next hub. So under the Data hub, here you will go and register any external source or target data sources within the workspace. The data sources that are contained within the workspaces are registered here. And in my case, I have a few data sources that's registered. And then you could do external data sources by clicking on this plus under the linked option. If I click on the plus, you would see I could register a SQL Synapse database. I could connect to an external data. And if I do that, it'll just give me the wizard to fill that out. Under the develop, what you have here is an environment where you go and build your SQL scripts. And in my case, I have a few that you could see. I would also then use this interface to go and build my data flows that's required for my pipeline. And any registration of your Power BI dashboards would happen here. To be able to do that, you click on the plus and you'll be able to have the options available to you. Thing to note here is that you could also create a notebook as well as your Spark job definitions from within this interface as well. Under the integrate, this is where you define your pipelines, and the pipelines are there to encompass all of the data flows and steps required to do your transformations from source to destination. So if you look at my integrate pipeline, I have 3 at the moment. We're going to come back to this place in a few minutes. Under the monitor, this is where you click on to go and look at what is currently being executed in the Synapse environment and to use this space to come in and debug any failures or errors that are occurred. And then additionally to come in and monitor any of your Spark SQL requests or data flow debugs. Under the manage, this is where you can also come in here and manage things like security and credentials, any integration runtimes and triggers, and be able to have a look at how to configure those for execution. So in our case, you'll see here my SQL on demand is online and my data warehouse within the Synapse workspace is paused. The data warehouse we're going to be used is an external source that I've registered as part of the Synapse link service. Okay, so now that we've seen that, let's quickly have a look at a Power BI report that I've integrated into the Synapse environment. In our case, this Power BI report reads that customer data sitting on the production table, and in our case, because it's empty, there's no reports or charts that are coming up. So you'll see it's empty. We will come back after we've loaded the data to come and see what this Power BI report looks like. Okay, so let's look at the pipeline. Now, for this, you would come to Orchestrate Hub or the Integrate Hub, and you'll see my 3 pipelines that are visible here. The pipeline that we're going to be working through is the process staging data. Now, this pipeline doesn't take a few minutes to run, so what I'll do is I'll trigger it off now so that it copies the data across while I explain each component of the pipeline. So we'll see there it's running at the moment. That's great. Okay, so if we look at the pipeline and we look at the integrate pipeline, I've selected the pipeline. To create a new one, we click on plus and click on pipeline. And in here, we'll give it a name and we'll be able to configure the properties for that particular pipeline. In our case, we'll just use the existing one that I've created. Now, once you've created a new pipeline, the activities tab allows you to perform functions in that pipeline. Now, if you look at the move and transform pipeline activity, you have 2 options, whether to copy data or a data flow. Data flow is used for more complex type of manipulation or transformations on the data. The copy data is just basically copying data from source to target with some minimal transformations in between. So in our case, we're going to use the data flow activity, and to do that, you just drag and drop that onto the canvas. Once you click on create new data flow, you'll see you have two options here, the data flow or wrangling data. I've selected the data flow for our case because the wrangling or the transformations were minimal in this case. Okay, so now that we've selected the data flow, let's look at what the data flow steps look like. If I double click on the data flow consists of 3 steps. The first step is to look at the raw data, which sits as CSV files in my container. So a couple of points that we'll raise here. Firstly, I've given it a name. Its source type is a data set. And there I've went in and registered where that data set resides. And if I click on open, it points to my storage account that sits in Azure, and to that particular folder to where that file exists. If I click on preview data, what you'll see is a sample set of the data that's come through from the CSVs that's linked to this process. A couple things to note here is I've highlighted that my first row has a header, and I've also then included, the properties required to read that CSVs, like what is the column delimiter on my CSV, for instance. Under my schema, you can have a look at what the schema looks like from the CSV files, and then parameters. If you've had introduced parameters, you'll be able to configure them there. Okay, with that, let's look at then, some of the properties on the higher level. So if you look at these properties, the one feature that I would like to highlight here is the allow schema drift. Now remember, our CSVs have different schemas, and to be able to facilitate one pipeline to read that data and process the data, I would select this checkbox to allow schema drift to take place. So this is an important one that I thought to highlight at this stage. Under the source options, you would have a look here. What I've done is I've actually stipulated, a kind of a mask to read data that only contained, as a prefix, external underscore customer data and star .csv. So it'll exclude any other data that's files that's sitting in the directory that doesn't conform to this particular standard. And then after the completion of the reading the data and process, and if it was successful, go and delete the source files. You could easily click on a move option and move it to an archive folder. On the projections here, I've applied some minimal transformations. Like for ID, I've now know that this is an integer and just given it a format. And my DT customer that I've received, I've also provided a date time format here. Under optimize, inspect, and under the data preview. So the data preview, if you've got data flow debug enabled, and I recommend when you're building these pipelines to do that, you would be able to see what the data looks like at the first step of this process. On the second step, what we're doing is we're adding some additional fields to the data that we've just ingested. And if you look at here, I've given it a name, and then the incoming stream is raw data, which is coming from first step. Thereafter, I've added 2 fields, the DT inserted and the country as South Africa. As DT inserted, I've just put in a timestamp value to that. Yeah, so that's the second step. And now we've got a total of 11 columns. So once we've done that, the next step is to write this data into the staging tables within the data warehouse. To be able to do that, what I did was to register the data warehouse, and then if I click on here, the open, it'll just allow me to open the properties of the data warehouse link server. And you'll see here I've selected my data warehouse. If I test connection, that should come back as successful, and that's all great. One highlight here is I've created a generic script that will create a new table every time this pipeline runs to take the data from the CSV files and place that into the warehouse in the staging tables. And you'll see this is the syntax to be able to do that. Okay, so once that is done, let's go back out. I just want to highlight then a couple more options here. Under settings, you can see here allow insert and enable staging would allow you to process that data successfully. And then just the table action to recreate the table. You could have the option of truncating the table. And then you have a mapping data set here. You could actually map the source to the destination and any optimizations that you want to apply to the data being read. And here you can inspect, the input and the output of the data sets coming in. Okay, great. So now that we've done the pipeline, the data flow pipeline, let's go back to the orchestrate pipeline, because now in the first step, we've taken the data from the CSV files, we've processed the data, applied some transformations, and then moved that data into the warehouse into staging tables. The next step is to take that data out of the staging tables and process that into the main tables. For that, I've created a proc that sits within the warehouse, and after the first step was successful, I would go and then successfully trigger off that proc. And to do that, all I did was to execute proc step as part of the process, and then under the settings part, list that proc that will then go and fire off that process that will read the data from the staging tables and then insert that new data into the customer table. So that is the final step of this process. Okay, now that you have a view of what are the steps required to do this pipeline or this transformation, let's go and have a look at the Monitor tab and see how our pipeline has executed. So, great news. The pipeline has succeeded. So we're able to have a look at how the execution happened. On clicking on that particular pipeline, you'll see the first step on the data flow, and then the second step as this proc that ran in the warehouse was successful. So both those steps were successful. If I come down to the bottom, you'll see, process staging data is successful, and then the row process data flow was also successful. If I click on this icon, which is a glass, it'll highlight and show me, what activities took place from a performance point and how the data was read from within the screen that you're just seeing now. Great. So this has all been successful. The next step out of this is to go and have a look at now our Power BI report and hit refresh, because we know now this should come back with some data. So if I go and hit refresh on that, it starts to bring back data. This is a very simplistic dashboard, I agree. It just reads the company data from that CSVs and then highlights which cities they come from. It kind of gives you a gender breakdown of the customers that you've received, and it gives you a tabular format of the customers that you've received. Now, the one thing I forgot to put onto this dashboard is a card to just illustrate, what is the total count of the data that was just ingested. And to do that, I've just then, added that on, and to give me, let's say, a count distinct, and you'll see there was 2,433 rows inserted into that particular one. On clicking of save, this dashboard then gets published into the Power BI portal and becomes available to the organization or the users that have access to this particular report. With that, I've come to the end of the demo and end of the presentation. Thank you for your time, and hopefully this is something that's valuable to you that you pick up and use as your learnings into Synapse. This has been a pipeline that we've been created within the Synapse environment. Synapse is really exciting, and it's something that to watch out for and start to use in your environments. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Happy to bounce some ideas off you on the Synapse environment. Thank you. Once again, thank you. I've just placed my LinkedIn profile as well as some additional links and references to some Azure resources around Synapse. The first one is around the Synapse main page, where you could read up on what the product is about, and then how to go about creating a Synapse workspace. You could have a look at these links for that particular function. Thanks.